Are you allowed to copy a designer's work for personal use? What constitutes a copy as being legal? And are fashion designs even protected under US copyright? We are going to discuss all of that and more in today's video, so stay tuned. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to a new video today. This was not a video I was originally planning on filming, but within the last week I've realized it's a video that I think is very fitting for my channel at this time, and also fitting for my channel moving forward with videos that I will be making and projects I will be creating, just to give you a little bit of backstory and background on my thought process behind my projects and my designs, and why I do what I do and my inspiration behind them, and also just to have a very honest conversation about fashion copyright, because that's an important topic that might be talked about. Maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you aren't super familiar with it, but it's something that influences the clothes that we wear every single day. It influences fashion, it influences the business of fashion. I think it's something we need to be aware of and discuss. So I really decided to make this video after getting a number of comments on my video about making the Rika Matoshi dress from people who were upset that I was knocking off or copying or plagiarizing Rika Matoshi's original dress. And I totally understand the concerns for those comments, like 100%. And I have tried to respond to each of those comments individually, because I think it's worth having a conversation about and explaining like the reason that I do what I do and like why I decided to make that project and my thought process behind it. With that being said, however, I want to clarify some things in this video and really have an open and honest, like, educational conversation about the business of fashion, something that we might not always take the time to go research or learn a lot about, or we might think that, you know, one aspect of legality in one area applies to everything, and that might not necessarily be the case, because when it comes to fashion from a business perspective and a design perspective, there's actually a lot of different laws that dictate what is fair and okay and not okay, that are different from like a lot of other art forms and businesses. First, I want to clarify that by definition, plagiarism is taking someone else's work and claiming it as your own without citing the original source, which, if you've watched my video about making the strawberry dress, which is kind of the inspiration for making today's video, but it also goes beyond that project because I think it's a topic that needs to be discussed. So if you've watched that video, you know that I never claim it as my own, that I continuously talk about the original designer, talk about the fact that my dress was inspired by the original designer. I'm not selling it to make a profit. I'm not selling the pattern. I'm not profiting from it in any way. And also, if you study my dress, you will know that it's not a carbon copy of the original. I actually changed a number of different things about the dress so that it wasn't exactly like the original. It's not like a complete copy. It's not a complete dupe. And in everything that I did, I continuously want to give credit to the original designer, because if we're being honest, I'm completely inspired by all these incredible designers, specifically by Rika Matoshi, and so it was through that inspiration that I wanted to challenge myself to make a project. It was never to steal from a designer and claim it as my own and just copy, because I don't think that's okay, and that happens way too much in the fashion industry. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation today, to really talk about what is fashion copyright, like what are the laws that dictate that when it comes to the clothes that we wear and the brands that we buy. So for those of you who are watching this video and have been around and seen my other videos and were worried about the fact that I was copying or plagiarizing or stealing from another designer, I do just want to like rest assured to you and like calm your fears and kind of explain it a little bit better, that by the laws of copyright, I was designing fully within the legal realms because of the choices that I make and how I create the project, and because my motivation was never to go in and steal from a designer. It was simply to be inspired by a designer's work and make it just literally for my own use, and just I wanted to share that process with others, and then it just kind of like blew up and got like super popular and a ton of views. So let's talk about what is fashion copyright. What is it? What does it do? What does it cover? What is acceptable? What are the rules, etc. So I knew a pretty good amount of copyright just from being a fashion design teacher and learning things throughout the years, because I do teach this in my classes. But I did additional research for this video because I wanted to make sure that I came forward with the best and most updated information. So I actually have pages and pages of notes that I'm going to be referencing throughout this video to make sure that I share the updated terms and the things that I learned to help you if you didn't know that this exists. So in doing my research, I did learn a lot of new things in regards to the legality of copyright and also a lot of legal terms. So before we go any farther, I want to highlight some specific terminology and define that, because understanding those terms and the definitions is going to help us moving forward when we're talking about this idea of fashion and copyright and the laws that dictate it. So those terms are copyright, copyright infringement, fair use, counterfeit, and piracy. All of which are terms you've probably heard, but you might not know the actual legal definition for them. So, copyright is a form of protection provided by the laws of the United States for original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, musical, architectural, cartographic, choreographic, pantomimic, pictorial, graphic, sculptural, and audiovisual creations. Copyright literally means the right to copy, but has come to mean that body of exclusive rights granted by law to copyright owners for protection of their work. Now, in addition to copyright, we have copyright infringement, which is defined as copyright infringement occurs when a copyrighted work is reproduced, distributed, performed, publicly displayed, or made into a derivative work without the permission of the copyright owner. So that's important to note. In addition to copyright infringement, we also have fair use, which is another important legal term when it comes to copyright. And according to copyright.gov, which I'm getting all of these definitions from, fair use is a legal doctrine that promotes freedom of expression by permitting the unlicensed use of copyright-protected works in certain circumstances. So Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses. So if you go into Section 107 of the Copyright Act, it actually outlines what is acceptable under fair use. So in determining whether the use made of a work in any particular case is a fair use, the factors to be considered shall include the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or for non-profit educational purposes, the nature of a copyrighted work, the amount of substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, and the effect of the use upon the potential market for our value of the copyrighted work. Alright, so the next term that we need to make sure we understand the terminology and definition for is counterfeit. Because while that applies to so many other industries and business, it also applies to fashion. So, while often mistaken for knockoff and infringement, counterfeit is by definition different as it describes fake goods. According to the International Counterfeit Coalition, counterfeiting is a federal and state crime involving the manufacturing and distribution of goods under someone else's name and without their permission. Counterfeit goods are generally made from lower quality components in an attempt to sell a cheap imitation of similar goods produced by brand consumers know and trust. So according to fashionlaw.com, the market for counterfeit clothing, textiles, footwear, handbags, cosmetics, and watches alone amounted to a whopping $450 billion and growing as of 2018. So counterfeit is a huge industry in many aspects, but also within the realms of fashion. So that's where you have your like knockoff Prada and knockoff Coach. That's like basically counterfeiting. There's a really interesting YouTube documentary about it that I will try and link below. And the last term we need to make sure we talk about is piracy, which doesn't necessarily really apply to fashion at all because it really applies to media, but it's worth mentioning when we're talking about copyrights. So this describes the act of reproducing movies, music, books, or other copyrighted works without the permission of the copyright owner. It's a colloquial term without legal significance, often used to describe willful copyright, patent, and trademark infringement, according to Nillo's Plain English Law Dictionary. So here's the scoop on copyright and fashion that we're going to talk about today. So when you hear the term copyright infringement, you might be prompted to think that copying another designer's work or like making something based off of another designer's work is copyright. And while that might indeed technically be true, it becomes kind of this gray area in fashion because fashion design is not actually fall under the umbrella of copyright and what copyright is defined as in the laws of copyright, which is really interesting if you didn't know. So by the net definition of copyright, being original works of authorship, fashion in the US is not protected under copyright law because fashion is viewed as functional, which is really interesting when you're talking about copyright and the legality of it when it comes to fashion. So in an article about copyright on fashionista.com, it stated that 100 years ago, the US Copyright Office made a decision that all fashion is functional. All clothing, no matter how fanciful and how elaborate, and functional items are excluded from protection by copyright in many cases, which is really, really interesting to consider. Because of this, many aspects of fashion, oddly enough, do not fall under copyright. This is why knockoffs are so prevalent in the United States. So in a quote in an article on Vox.com talking about this issue, they said that brands are able to keep copying one another because of outdated legal doctrines. Unlike music, drama, literature, and art, fashion is not and never has been adequately protected under American copyright law, meaning clothing designs can be duplicated without permission. And it's because of this that we have so many knockoffs, and we do have counterfeits, and we do have like duplicates of things by designers today, but there's a whole lot of gray area when it comes to it and the kind of inspiration and motivation of that designer behind what they're doing and what they're going to do with that design. And that's what you have to kind of be really clear on when you're talking about fashion and being inspired or copying or making something based off of something that already previously existed. So the copyright laws that govern fashion in the US are actually quite different from copyright laws in other countries like Europe and the UK. So one reason being that fashion is a huge part of the American economy. There's a ton of articles that are talking about the fact that if there were more strict rules and guidelines in regards to copywriting in the United States, if it would actually harm or help the industry, because so much of the industry is centered on actually like duplicating themselves and duplicating each other, which is a really interesting thing to consider. So economically, because the fashion industry is such a huge part of the economy, if you put more regulations on what brands are actually producing, therefore keeping them from making a profit from that, would it help or harm the economy? Like, it's a really interesting thing to consider. Additionally, while the US does not have strict copyright laws that protect fashion designs, it's different in other countries. For example, the European Union grants 3-year protection to original fashion designs and allows creators to apply for a 25-year extension. This does not exist in the US. There are not 3 years that protect designs, which is interesting to think about when you think about the fact that all of our luxury high-end brands actually originated in other countries. They originated in, you know, Paris. They originated in Italy. And that's where the ateliers and the original couture houses for all of these high-end luxury brands were originally based. And so it makes sense that there's actually a lot more copyright laws in those countries governing fashion because it is more high-end and luxury, while the United States tends to be a lot more fast fashion off the rack. And in many aspects, if you go and do additional research, you're going to see that's in many ways why the United States doesn't actually have laws governing copyright. Now, let's be clear on something. Just because it's technically legal doesn't mean that it's okay. And that's where there is a ton of gray area when it comes to making something based off of another designer's original piece. Because obviously this happens a lot, but what's the gray area? Not necessarily how do you get around it so that you can like get away with it, but how do you legally make something maybe just for your own use based off of another designer's work. So obviously if we view fashion as art, there's this whole kind of like ethical conversation that could arise about copying someone else. Yes, fashion is technically art, but within the realms of the law, it's functional. It's not really necessarily art. And so that's kind of where this whole kind of issue comes in. However, that conversation differs and changes a lot when the person making that piece based off of another designer does not claim it as their own and is not making it for a profit, because it kind of in a way eradicates all of the legal issues they might run into. Because by law, you're actually allowed to create something and use something that could potentially be copyrighted, even though fashion isn't copyrighted, for your own use based on the fair use policy, because you're not actually profiting from it and claiming it as your own. You're just using it for your own use. So when it comes to like making designs and your own projects based on other designers just for yourself, it's technically legal. Now when it comes to the business of fashion and big corporations and brands copying other people and claiming it as their own and selling it to make a profit, that's where the issue comes in. So we can talk about independent creators making projects inspired by and based off of designers' pieces all day long. In fashion, however, the big issue is that big fashion brands are copying smaller brands all the time, especially when they are fast fashion companies whose main objective is to get those trends from off the runway and marketed and created and produced into their stores as quickly as possible. And I'm pretty sure the turnaround rate for a brand looking at what's on trend, looking what just came out on the runway, and getting those trends into their stores 2 weeks. And if you know the technicalities of fashion and what goes into producing and creating a garment, the fact that styles and trends can have that quick of a turnover to a fast fashion brand store in 2 weeks is pretty crazy. And that brings up a whole other conversation about ethical fashion that I will probably talk about at some point, because it's another thing I'm very passionate about. So in an article on businessoffashion.com, the journalist Helen Pike said that today knockoffs are more rife than ever before. Fast fashion companies like Zara and H&M have built multi-billion-dollar businesses reproducing the latest catwalk creations for a fraction of their original cost, and copying existing among luxury brands too. In the past few years, companies including Saint Laurent have faced lawsuits from other fashion houses. So there's obviously, when copyright is, being infringed upon, even though fashion is technically not copyrighted and brands are copying each other, there are always lawsuits going on. But a lot of times, if it's a big company copying a smaller company and designer, that big company has the money for a legal team, and so that lawsuit probably won't go through. And because there are no laws about copyright in fashion, a lot of times there's not a lot of proof to go off of, which is kind of like unfortunate when designers are working really hard to create something, and then other businesses are profiting from that design. It's a lot different if you're just like an independent creator making it for yourself and not doing anything with it. So when we're talking about fashion designs and designers and copying and copyright, the big issue in fashion comes in when a brand claims a design as their own when it was clearly copied from another brand or designer. Therefore they're profiting from another designer, and that's when like the counterfeiting happens and the actual like dupes and copies happen. Is another brand is like, oh, these are our sunglasses that we came up with, and they're not giving credit to the original designer. They're selling it for a fraction of the cost. They're profiting from it. That happens all the time in the United States when it comes to fashion, because we don't have laws really dictating copyright, which is really interesting. And that's why I want us to like really talk about this today and make sure we understand this and understand the backstory behind your clothes and where they're coming from. So the interesting thing about things being copied is that you have things that are purposely copied and duplicated from another designer or brand, but because brands and businesses and designers every season are working with set trends, which has to do with color and prints and styles and silhouettes for the trends of the season, and they're all kind of creating things based off of what has been forecasted as being in style that season. Sometimes brands can indirectly, accidentally make something that is very much like another brand without meaning to, because they're all working with the same styles and trends. But then again, you also have times when they're like, oh, this high-end luxury brand created this $500 dress, but our customer base doesn't have money to pay $500 for that, so we're going to create a cheaper version, claim it as our own, and sell it for profit to our customers. That's kind of how fashion works in the United States. Now, in talking about all of this, I want to be really clear in noting that what I am sharing in today's video is not sharing this to give creators like free reign to just go and steal from other creators, because that's not okay. Creators put a lot of hard work and effort into what they design, and it's not fair that someone else would profit from that. That's why we really need to understand copyright. Nor is it to share to just make excuses for choices or what we do. And this is why I want to talk about this today, because specifically in projects in the past that I have made based on and inspired by a designer, some people have been really like upset and worried that I might be actually copying from that designer, and that's never my intention going in. And it's not my intention because I understand what is allowed as an independent creator who's not profiting from it and not claiming it as my own. And it's the same thing going forward in the future. I can definitely say this is not the last time that I will do a project that is inspired by and based off of a high-end design. A lot of creators do that to stretch their skills, to inspire other people about the capabilities of creativity. And so I don't do what I do to take credit away from designers, because I 100% support the original designers. But I also know as a seamstress that I can't always necessarily afford that, but I'm technically allowed to make it for my own use, not claiming it as my own, but still giving credit to the original designer. So I am, however, sharing it to help you understand what is allowed under copyright law, something that you might not necessarily understand or have learned about or done the research on, and what is acceptable under moral principles when you do not claim the work as your own and don't make a profit. And that's really important to understand, because copyright in fashion is completely different to so many other aspects of copyright. And in some instances it's very unfortunate, but it also allows you to legally create something for yourself. So before you get upset that I created my own version of a designer dress while clearly giving credit to that designer, and talking about it being based on the original designer and the original dress, you should consider also whether the clothes that you're wearing are knockoffs, because we live in a country whose fashion industry is largely based on fast fashion, which means, one, it's based on a lot of knockoffs and copying of higher end designers, and two, it's also based on very quick turnovers when it comes to fashion, which means they are most times not made in ethical ways, which is the big hot topic right now in fashion. So a lot of times the clothes you buy could be knockoffs from other designers, but you have no idea because they are marketed as the brand that it says on that tag, when they might clearly actually be a copy and being based off of another high-end design. So even more so, we should talk about the fact that copies of designs we buy from fast fashion brands are going to be produced in a way that makes them be able to be sold at such a low cost that people are willing to buy it. And in order for it to be sold at such a low cost, and therefore has to be produced at a low cost, which one means that the quality is not going to be as good, and two, you have to pay your workers for making that garment. And if a garment is being sold for like $30-$40, that means the workers are being paid next to nothing. They're not being paid a living wage. And that's the whole issue with like ethical fashion, the conversation that's happening right now, and the whole issue when it comes to fast fashion brands. So when we're talking about like actual copies and actual dupes and actual like counterfeits, that's where there's a whole legal issue because of the ethical aspect of it and another brand claiming it as their own design. So if a creator wants to make their own version, like let's say of a design for their own use, maybe because they can't afford the original piece, like I was saying, they're technically being more ethical by not buying from a fast fashion brand and paying a lower cost, but literally making it themselves. It's technically more ethical to make your own clothes than to go out and buy from a brand, spend $20 on a dress, because the production process of that, if you actually look into it, is not all that great when it comes to ethical fashion and the laws actually dictating safe working environments, because that's a whole other side of legal aspects of the fashion industry. Like another thing to talk about is we always talk about like Amazon dupes, like it's a huge thing. It's like a huge thing on TikTok, you know, dupes of jewelry and shoes and sunglasses of designer brands, and we go and buy those dupes because they're more affordable to us, and we know that they're a duplicate of a designer brand that we, you know, can't afford, but yet it's marketed and it's sold being claimed by another brand as their original design, and they're profiting from it. That's part of the fashion industry that we live in the United States. So copying is happening all around us because copyright laws don't dictate it. Doesn't mean it's okay, no, but technically people can get around it because it's legal and you can claim it as your own. So to kind of wrap up this educational conversation about the business of fashion and copyright and how that dictates and plays into the fashion industry in the United States today, here's a few things I want you to remember. Both affordable fast fashion brands and high-end luxury brands copy other designers. Does it mean it's okay? No, it doesn't mean it's okay. but it's literally happening all the time, and we need to start I think it's important that we like consider that when we go out and purchase clothes. And also, fashion designers are essentially artists, and their designs have value. And I think that we should respect designers and the way that we treat their designs, but also by like rules of design and copyright and also fair use, you are technically allowed to make your own version of something for yourself. Like, that's the whole legality of it that I want to make sure that you understand. Am I saying to just go out and duplicate everything? No. And I'm also not saying to go out and duplicate everything and then sell it for a profit, because you shouldn't do that. But if you see a garment of fashion that you like, you are allowed to technically make it for yourself for your own use under the rules of the law when it comes to copyright. So that is a wrap on this conversation in regards to fashion copyright. I hope that you learned something today. I hope if you were worried about my inspiration for designs and projects, that this maybe clears up my motivations and reasoning and rationale behind my projects a little bit, and also maybe it starts to get you thinking a little bit about the business of fashion, the backstory behind fashion that you might not know about, that you might not have researched before, and maybe go and do a little bit of research on it, because fashion is a huge industry and there's so many aspects and facets to it, especially how it ties to every other aspect of society. And so when you go and actually study all the intricacies and the ins and outs of it, it's really interesting to see that there's a lot you don't know, and there's a lot that's actually affecting our everyday life, and it's really interesting to consider. So if you learned something new from this video, I would love to hear what kind of triggered your brain when we were having these educational conversations about copyright and fashion. So drop me a comment below. Let me know what was new, what was interesting, what you want to learn more about, or even if you still have any concerns, I would love to start a conversation with you. But thank you guys so much for listening to this conversation about the business of fashion, what is legal, what's not, and the backstory behind fashion copyright in the United States. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.